The organ's first chord rolled through the church and rattled the glass in the vestibule, and I felt the wax seal in my palm soften just a little under the heat of my skin, a tiny pressed fern buried in cream-colored lacquer. I could smell peonies and floor polish, hear the quick, bright laughter that always comes right before vows, and for a moment, I remembered being 24 and unafraid of anything. I stood beneath the balcony out of sight, watching the aisle that I had walked once before in another decade, in another life, where I still believed that love and loyalty were twins. The envelope was quiet, but it pulsed like a second heartbeat, a soft promise that the truth could stand without shouting. I didn't plan to disrupt. I planned to witness and to hand the right words to the right person at the right moment. It was not rage that steadied me, but clarity, the kind that makes your breath come easy and your shoulders drop. When the doors to the sanctuary swung inward and the crowd rose as one, I knew this was the exact threshold where a soft-spoken woman stops being a backdrop. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if stories of quiet justice speak to you, remember to like and subscribe so more women can find a little peace before they sleep. My name is Nora Bennett, and most days I am the steady one, the person who keeps emergency phone numbers laminated and field trip forms, alphabetized the school counselor who remembers which third grader hates thunder and which fifth grader pretends not to. I was raised by my father in a narrow brick row house outside Philadelphia, where Saturday mornings smelled like coffee and sawdust, and where promises were tools you kept sharp. We didn't have much, but our house was honest, and the kind of quiet that lived there was the good kind. When I met Mark at a friend's cookout, him all confident laughter and clean lines, a man who could fix a leaky faucet and a spreadsheet in the same afternoon, I thought I'd found the safe edge of the world. We married in a church with cracked stone steps and a choir that sang off-key in a way that made you cry anyway. And I believed what everyone told us, that we were practical, a sure bet made of sensible glue. Lila came into my life even earlier, tall and quick-minded, with a voice that could settle a room and eyes that could read it. We bonded over cheap coffee and unpaid internships, then kept each other through moves, job changes, and the flaming wreckage of first tries. Where I was, the ground she was, the match that lit the candles. Where I remembered birthdays, she remembered how to turn any Tuesday into a moment. We braided our lives without thinking about it. Holiday leftovers traded in mismatched Tupperware, group texts that never slept, shared recipes, and inside jokes that could undo a bad day. When Mark and I bought our small gray house on a maple-lined street, Lila helped me paint the trim and declared the porch a stage for everyday joy. For years it was. We were the house with the extra folding chairs and the grill that never really cooled the place you came when you needed a favor or a laugh or a casserole with too much cheese. Our life didn't glitter, but it had a shine that comes from elbow grease and showing up the kind of rhythm that settles into a couple without anyone announcing it. Mark worked long days at the logistics hub and came home with stories about the trucks that made America hum. I kept the school calendar and the neighborhood's birthdays in my head like a hymn. Money wasn't careless, but it wasn't tight either. We were comfortable, the kind of middle that lets you buy the nicer sheets without feeling extravagant. On Friday nights, we cooked together, me chopping, while he told a story twice, as long as the ingredients list. Then we ate on the porch while Murphy snored on the mat. If there were frayed edges, I smoothed them with habit, believing that good choices and steady love could hold anything. Looking back, I can see the first shift arrive softly, the way a room changes temperature before you notice the open window. He started coming home later, not by hours, just by slivers that added up, carrying a new restlessness that he blamed on restructuring and quarterly targets. Lila was suddenly busier than busy, full of consult calls and client dinners that seemed to find the same nights Mark stayed at the office. I told myself life runs in waves, that friendship and marriage have seasons, that the people who love you can be pulled away by things that aren't you. Then one evening, washing wine glasses under a string of porch lights, I lifted Mark's jacket from the back of a chair. and something sharp and expensive hit me. Cedar and bergamot with a sweetness I didn't own, and my hands went very still as the water ran and ran. The jacket should have gone back on the hook, but instead I held it over the sink with the faint steam curling around us. The scent wasn't mine. It wasn't soap from the office bathroom or the cologne Mark used every Christmas since our first year together. This was sharper, more deliberate something layered that clung to fabric long after skin had left it. I told myself not to overthink, but my hands lingered on the lining until the water ran cold. When he finally came into the kitchen whistling low, I slipped the jacket over the chair again and turned my face so he wouldn't see how still I had become. The weeks that followed blurred into habits that looked the same, but no longer felt the same. Mark said he was late because of meetings that dragged or shipments that needed his signature. He didn't notice that I stopped asking questions, or maybe he preferred it that way. Lila, too, began sending last-minute messages that she had to cancel our dinners, apologizing with hearts and promises to reschedule. Then I'd see her online later posting polished photos of wine glasses and city lights tagged with vague captions about living fully. I scrolled past them quickly, but something inside me had already started to shift like a clock counting down to an hour I didn't want to reach. It was a Saturday morning in early spring when the three of us sat down together for brunch, something we hadn't done in months. I'd made lemon pancakes. Murphy curled under the table, and for a moment it felt almost like the old rhythm. Then Lila walked in wearing a deep shade of red lipstick bolder than her usual soft tones. Mark noticed first. He looked up from pouring syrup and said, "That color suits you." She laughed nervously, brushing it off, but I saw the way her shoulders lifted. "He added bold works on you." I smiled because what else was I supposed to do, but a hollow space opened in my chest. He hadn't complimented me in over a year. Not even when I wore the dress he once said reminded him of summer evenings. That dress had waited in the closet until our 10th anniversary. I slipped it on set, the table with candles, and cooked his favorite meal, even though my heart already knew what kind of night it would be. He came home distracted, murmured a tired, happy anniversary, and ate without noticing the effort I had laid in front of him. Afterward, he sat in silence on the couch until sleep claimed him. I lay awake beside him that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all that was left of a marriage I once believed could last through any storm. My father had taught me that loyalty was a tool you kept sharp, but lying there in the dark, I realized Mark no longer even reached for it. I didn't tell anyone about the emptiness I carried. Not my coworkers, not my father, not even Lila, who had always been my sounding board. I kept believing that if I tried harder, if I smiled more, cooked, better stayed patient, something might click back into place, but each attempt only deepened the silence. He answered with grunts or short phrases, always distracted, never asking about the children I counseled at school, or the little stories that used to make him laugh. I was still giving, still carrying the weight of us both, but the return was nothing more than the sound of a television filling the space where conversation used to live. One afternoon, searching for a receipt, I found a folded slip from a downtown hotel tucked into the pocket of Mark's blazer. The date made my pulse race. It was the same weekend he told me he'd been in Pittsburgh for a company retreat. My fingers went numb holding that paper, and though I slipped it back exactly where I'd found it, my body knew the truth, even if my mind wasn't ready to say it. A few weeks later, when Lila stopped answering my calls for nearly a month, the edges of the picture began to come into focus. And then, on a Tuesday after school walking past the corner cafe, I saw them. They were seated near the window, leaning close, laughing in a way that had once been ours. Her hand rested lightly on his, like it had always belonged there. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, invisible, watching the two people I trusted most build something out of my absence. No one in that cafe saw me standing there. The world kept moving, cars passing, steam rising from paper cups, strangers tapping keyboards. I felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out my chest and left only the shell behind. But in that emptiness, something new flickered, quiet, small, but steady. It wasn't anger, yet not even grief. It was the beginning of clarity. I walked away without knocking on the glass or confronting them. I simply carried the moment home, set it down inside me, and let it settle like a stone at the bottom of a river. From then on, I started noticing details I had once brushed aside. How Mark recycled the same jokes at dinners that I had written into holiday letters years before. How Lila wore the gold necklace I'd given her for her birthday, the one she once called timeless. How their bodies angled toward each other when they thought no one was looking. The evidence was everywhere, hiding in plain sight, and the realization was both devastating and liberating. I could no longer pretend. I could no longer smooth over the silence. I could no longer believe that loyalty would return if I just waited. The first crack had split open, and though it didn't yet break the whole structure, I knew the fracture could not be undone. What I didn't know then was how far they were willing to take it, how bold they would become, and how much they underestimated the quiet woman they had both relied on for so long. And that certainty, sharp and unyielding, was only the beginning of what would come next. After that day at the cafe, I carried the weight of what I had seen like a stone in my chest, heavy enough to change the way I breathed. I didn't cry right away. The tears came later in quiet bursts when I was alone. At first, it was disbelief that settled over me. Then the kind of silence you keep when words would only bruise your own mouth. I walked through my days the way a ghost might present, but no longer fully visible, performing my duties, smiling when expected, but breaking in places no one could see. At school, my students handed me crayon drawings with misshapen hearts, and I taped them to my desk with a steadiness I didn't feel. I answered their questions, listened to their fears, and gave comfort I could not find at home. When I drove back in the afternoons, the sight of our gray house on the tree-lined street looked less like shelter and more like a stage set waiting for characters who no longer believed in their lines. Inside, Mark carried on as if the ground beneath us hadn't shifted. He asked about bills or reminded me about the yard work, never once looking long enough to notice my eyes were swollen from sleepless nights. The betrayal took a toll in small, relentless ways. Meals I once enjoyed turned to tasteless chores. The sound of the front door closing behind him each morning felt like a relief, but the sound of it opening at night carried dread. I moved slower, spoke softer, laughed less, until I hardly recognized my own reflection in the mirror. My father noticed the change before anyone else. He asked gently if everything was all right, his weathered hands folded around a coffee mug at the kitchen table. I smiled and said I was tired, because how do you tell the man who taught you loyalty that his daughter's life had been cracked in half by the two people she trusted most? Lila's absence spoke louder than her presence ever had. She used to text late at night, sharing jokes or memories, but now my phone stayed quiet. I scrolled through our old conversations, staring at the words of affection that once felt so permanent, and wondered how easily she had discarded them. On weekends, I walked Murphy through the neighborhood pretending I didn't notice when couples waved from porches or friends clustered in driveways. I felt like an outsider in my own life, invisible even as I moved among familiar streets. The hardest part wasn't their betrayal. It was how easily they seemed to live inside it, as if it cost them nothing. At a charity gala a few months later, I saw them together again, and the truth could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. The ballroom was filled with polished laughter and clinking glasses, chandeliers scattering light across faces I had once welcomed to our home. Mark stood with his hand on Lila's back, guiding her through the crowd as if she had always belonged at his side. Their closeness was not accidental, their smiles too practiced, their chemistry too seamless to be mistaken. They weren't hiding anymore. They were introducing themselves as something new. When our eyes met across the room, Mark didn't look ashamed. Instead, he lifted his glass slightly, a smug tilt of his chin that told me he knew exactly what he was doing. Lila's smile flickered when she saw me, but she quickly leaned closer to him, her laugh echoing too loudly, the kind you use when you want the world to notice. People I had once considered friends watched them like they were a story unfolding, one of bravery and fresh beginnings, while I stood at the edge of the room, rewritten as a footnote. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was performance. They were rewriting history right in front of me, and everyone was invited to believe it. Toward the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and the music softened, Lila approached me alone. Her heels struck the marble floor with sharp certainty, and she stopped just close enough that I could smell the champagne on her breath. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice smooth but rehearsed. "I know this must feel strange." Strange. That was the word she chose for the wreckage she had helped create. I held her gaze, saying nothing because silence was all I trusted myself with. She continued, her tone softer, as if she were offering me a gift. "We never planned for this to happen. But love is messy. You and Mark were drifting apart, and I cut her off, my voice low. And what? He fell into your bed by accident." Her eyes darted away just for a second, then returned with a calm she had practiced in mirrors. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We're getting married, and I want you to be okay with that, for your own peace." Peace, as if she could hand it to me wrapped in tissue paper. I gave her a slow nod, the kind you offer when you're done pretending there's a shared language left between you. When I walked away from that gala, my steps were measured, but my heart felt sharper than it had in months. Their betrayal was no longer hidden, and my grief was no longer aimless. I understood now what I had been unwilling to admit before. They hadn't just broken my trust, they wanted me erased. They wanted to claim my history as theirs, to wear the life I had built, and call it their own. The pain was still raw, but beneath it, something else stirred. A quiet clarity, the kind that doesn't roar but whispers steadily, "You are not as powerless as they think." And that clarity, thin but unyielding, was what carried me forward. Because what came next was no longer about waiting for them to confess or hoping they would falter. It was about me and what I would choose to do with the truth they had tried so hard to bury. I left the gala with my heels clicking against the stone, each step heavier than the last. But something inside me had changed. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. For months, I had carried the betrayal like a wound that wouldn't close, raw and consuming. That night, watching them stand together laughing, as if they hadn't stolen entire pieces of my life, something finally shifted. The sorrow gave way to clarity, and the silence I had been drowning in became a sharper, steadier kind of strength. I couldn't undo what they had done, but I could decide what to do next. The first time I tried to write, I poured anger onto the page. Every insult, every bitter thought, every curse I had swallowed came spilling out in uneven strokes. I tore that letter apart before I reached the end. Rage burned hot, but it burned out quickly, and I didn't want to give them something that could be dismissed as fury. What I wanted was lasting, undeniable truth. So I started again, this time carefully setting down the details, that could not be argued. The dates that lined up too neatly, the receipts that told their own story, the emails that had slipped through, and the photographs where body language said what words did not. Piece by piece, I built a quiet record, one they would never expect from the woman they thought would stay silent. At the same time, I began taking small steps for myself, ones that didn't look like rebellion, but felt like freedom. I stopped answering calls from people who only wanted gossip. I declined invitations I didn't want to accept, no longer feeling the need to explain myself. I bought groceries I liked, instead of planning meals around Mark's preferences. In the evenings, I pulled out the paints I had abandoned years ago, spreading color on canvas in broad strokes, until the silence in the house felt less heavy. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to imagine a life that didn't revolve around keeping someone else comfortable. When I was ready, I called Melissa Crane, a lawyer recommended by a colleague at school. She met me in her small office above a bakery, where the smell of cinnamon rolls drifted up through the vents. Melissa wasn't flashy or overly reassuring. She listened, tapping her pen lightly against her notebook, and when I finished explaining, she asked only one question. "Do you want to bury them, or free yourself?" I answered without hesitation. "Both." Her nod was small, but in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in months. I felt seen. With her guidance, I went back through the stacks of documents Mark had left for me to sign during our separation. He had assumed I would skim them too broken to notice the details. Melissa and I found loopholes, investments he hadn't disclosed, and joint assets he had tried to claim as his own. We filed quiet motions, froze accounts, and amended agreements. I didn't shout or accuse. I simply walked through the doors he had carelessly left open one by one. Each step was measured not in retaliation, but in protection. He thought my silence meant surrender. It didn't. It meant I was paying attention. Those weeks were hard in ways I hadn't expected. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if I was strong enough to follow through. Other nights, I reminded myself that staying quiet had cost me too much already. In the daylight, I taught my students how to manage fear with breathing exercises, and when they closed their eyes, I did the same. Slowly, the weight began to feel lighter. I wasn't waiting for Mark to notice me, or for Lila to remember the friend she had abandoned. I was building something steady for myself, and it made their absence easier to bear. The turning point came when I stopped asking why. Why he had chosen her. Why she had betrayed me. Why they both believed they could erase me from my own story. Those questions had no answers that would heal. What mattered was that I could finally see the truth without flinching, and I could stand in it without breaking. That realization was the beginning of my awakening. I didn't need them to admit what they had done. I didn't need an apology that would never come. What I needed was to reclaim the voice I had quieted for too long. The letter I wrote after that was different. It wasn't angry or pleading. It was clear, measured, and precise. Each paragraph documented another piece of what they had hidden, not to shame them, but to show them that their lies had always been transparent to someone who was willing to look. At the end, I wrote only one sentence that came from my heart. This is not a plea and not a threat. It is simply the truth, breathing. When I sealed that envelope, I felt steadier than I had in months. Still, I didn't rush. I carried on with my days, watching as spring warmed into summer, as Murphy chased squirrels along the fence, as my father sat with me on the porch drinking iced tea without pressing for answers. The letter waited just as I did until the moment would arrive when silence would no longer be enough. What mattered was that I was no longer hiding from it. I had found a way to stand even if my knees still trembled. What I didn't know then was how perfectly that moment would present itself, and how ready I would be to deliver the truth they thought would stay buried forever. 3 months before their wedding, my phone rang while I was cooking dinner. The number was familiar, but unexpected. It was Claire, Lila's younger sister. We had crossed paths over the years at family barbecues and holiday gatherings, never close, but cordial. Her voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as she explained why she was calling. She had seen something that bothered her and thought I should know. "I just found out you're not in the bridal party," she said carefully. I let out a dry laugh and told her that time had long passed, but she pressed on. "It's not that. It's what they're telling people. They're saying you gave them your blessing, that you've moved on, and you want everyone to support them." I stood very still, the wooden spoon in my hand, dripping sauce back into the pot. Claire's words weren't surprising, not after everything, but they landed like another small cut in a body already covered in scars. They weren't satisfied with stealing each other. They wanted to polish their betrayal until it gleamed like virtue. I thanked her for telling me, kept my voice steady, and ended the call before she could offer pity. Then I set the spoon down and leaned against the counter, the kitchen suddenly too quiet. That was the moment the decision crystallized. I would not confront them with shouting. I would not try to match their performance. I would answer them the way they had once answered me, with elegance and timing disguised in civility. I began with the letter, not the raw draft I had once torn apart, but a new creation written with deliberate restraint. I opened simply, "You probably thought I wouldn't come." From there, I built it piece by piece, like assembling a clock. No rage, no accusations, only truth in paragraphs that ticked forward with precision. I detailed their months of lies, cross-referenced with dates and receipts laid out with the calm clarity of a ledger. I didn't sign it with my name. Instead, I closed with one line: "There is nothing louder than the truth whispered at the right moment." While the letter rested in my desk drawer, I prepared for the performance they expected. I mailed back an RSVP card, neatly checking with pleasure. I even chose a gift, a crystal vase blown by hand, smooth and fragile, accompanied by a card that read, "May this never shatter." Days later, I saw it displayed on Lila's social media, photographed with flowers inside, captioned with one of her polished lines, "When the past is healed, the future opens." The irony made me smile faintly. They believed I had forgiven, that I had accepted the story they wanted the world to believe. That illusion was the stage I needed. Melissa helped me shape the second part of the plan. She scheduled emails time-stamped and sealed to be delivered the moment the ceremony concluded. 3 messages each, carrying not just my letter, but the supporting documents, the timeline, the receipts, the financial records Mark thought he had hidden. One was addressed to Mark's business partner, another to his father, and a third to a local editor who had recently profiled Lila as a rising voice in values-based storytelling. Melissa prepared everything quietly, her voice calm as she slid copies into a folder across her desk. "Timing will do the rest," she said, and for the first time, I believed it. The morning of the wedding, I dressed in black. Not a morning gown, but a simple dress that carried no decoration chosen because it made me feel clear. I arrived early, blending into the sea of pastel dresses and tailored suits my presence barely noticed. From the second row, I watched them move through the crowd like royalty, his hand steady on her back, her smile radiant and practiced. They greeted guests, posed for photographs, laughed too loudly when whispers rose behind them. But I noticed the cracks no one else saw. Mark's eyes were tired, darting toward the door as though expecting trouble. Lila snapped at the coordinator over a misplaced ribbon, her voice just sharp enough to reveal the edge beneath the charm. The ceremony began, and the organ filled the church with sound. They exchanged vows, voices steady as if the past had never existed. Rings slid onto fingers, promises spoken into air already heavy with lies. When the priest announced them as husband and wife, the crowd erupted into applause. That was when I stood. My heels clicked against the aisle as I walked forward, calm and measured. Mark's smile faltered, and Lila blinked, her expression tightening, as though she had seen a ghost. I reached the altar, slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, and leaned close enough that only he could hear. "Read it before the reception," I whispered. Then I turned and walked away. Not rushed, not shaken, just steady. The envelope looked small, but I knew it carried more weight than either of them imagined. They thought the story was finished, that I had been written out, but what I had handed him was the first page of an ending they couldn't escape. What they didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that the letter in his pocket wasn't the only one that would speak. By the time the organ faded and the guests began filing out into the sunlight, the first email had already landed in an inbox. Phones buzzed quietly in purses and pockets, the opening ripples of a storm they had never prepared for. And as I stepped out of the church, the late morning sun warm on my face, I felt lighter than I had in years, because the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. It had been placed exactly where it needed to be, in hands that would not allow it to be forgotten. And soon enough, Mark and Lila would discover what it felt like when the silence they relied on finally broke. The church emptied into the bright September air, guests gathering on the steps for photographs while petals scattered across the stone. I walked past them with measured steps, feeling the weight of eyes on my back. Inside, Mark had vanished to the groom's suite, with the envelope burning in his pocket. What he didn't know was that Melissa's scheduled emails had already been delivered. By the time he reached the second paragraph, 3 other people were reading the same words each, with attachments that left no space for denial. Mark's father, Thomas, sat in a corner of the reception hall when the first vibration buzzed through his phone. He frowned as he scrolled, lips tightening as he read. Across town, Mark's business partner opened the same message, scanning through hotel receipts and financial withdrawals marked against company accounts. And in a newsroom office, an editor skimmed the email bearing Lila's name, paired with evidence that her shining reputation as a voice of values had been built on secrecy. What I had carried in silence for months now belonged to them, and it was only a matter of time before the ripple reached the center of the room. I wasn't there to watch Mark return to the reception, pale and unsteady. Guests noticed the sweat on his collar, the way his smile twitched but wouldn't hold. Lila reached for his hand with the kind of public affection meant to reassure a crowd, not a partner. "Everything all right?" she whispered, but his eyes stayed on the floor. Phones buzzed again, one at the best man's table, another in the maid of honor's clutch. Whispers began to move faster than the music, subtle at first, then sharp, as if the room itself had shifted in temperature. By the time Lila stepped aside to answer a call from the editor who had featured her just weeks before, her polished poise was already cracking. I imagined the moment her smile dissolved as she listened to his clipped words, warning her that the story would be amended, that questions were coming she could not dodge. I pictured her walking back into the hall, phone trembling in her hand, only to see Mark clutching the letter like it might ignite. Their wedding day, the one they had dared to invite me to celebrate, had turned into a stage where the truth performed without my voice needing to rise above a whisper. That evening, while their world tilted, I sat on my porch with Murphy snoring at my feet. I poured a glass of wine and listened to the quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Melissa had called earlier to confirm that the deliveries had gone out as planned. "No need to follow up," she said calmly. "They'll be doing that themselves." I thanked her not with triumph, but with relief. I didn't need to be present for the chaos. I only needed to know the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. The fallout was swift. By morning, Lila's feature was quietly removed from the magazine's website, the headline replaced by a blank space that said more than any printed retraction could. Mark's business partner issued a statement about internal restructuring, which effectively pushed him out of the company he had assumed would always be his. A wire transfer landed in my account. My full settlement amended by Melissa, plus interest. No words accompanied it, just numbers, but I understood it for what it was. Guilt is expensive, and legal leverage speaks louder than apologies. A week later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Lila. I let it go to voicemail, listening only after her voice trailed off into the recording. "I know you're angry," she began, her tone shaky but still laced with the need to shape the narrative. "But this was cruel. We didn't deserve it like this." She tried to sound wounded, to reframe betrayal as a misstep, but her words faltered under their own weight. I didn't call back. I saved the message instead, a reminder that silence when chosen unsettles the guilty, more than rage ever could. Mark never reached out. No calls, no letters, not even a message passed through mutual friends. Perhaps he understood there was nothing left to salvage, or perhaps he finally recognized that my quiet wasn't weakness. Either way, his absence spoke louder than any attempt at explanation. Friends told me he looked diminished when they saw him, as if the years had caught up to him overnight. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. My part was finished the moment I placed the letter in his pocket. Life around me carried on as though nothing had changed. At school, children still handed me drawings, still ran down hallways calling my name. My father still arrived on Sunday mornings with bagels and stories from the hardware store. On the surface, my days were ordinary, but beneath them flowed a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I no longer had to pretend. I no longer had to guard secrets that weren't mine to keep. For the first time since the betrayal began, I breathed without bracing. And yet I knew this wasn't the end. Exposing the truth was only one piece of the reckoning. The silence I carried now wasn't emptiness, it was anticipation. Because sooner or later, both of them would try to face me, and when that moment came, I would be ready. It was 3 weeks after the wedding collapsed when I ran into Lila at the Saturday farmers market. The air smelled of apples and lavender soap, and the tables overflowed with bright produce. She was holding a bundle of eucalyptus like a shield, her shoulders drawn tight, her eyes darting as if searching for escape. When she finally saw me, she froze. For a long moment, we simply stood across from each other, people passing between us without realizing the silence that had settled there. She spoke first, her voice thin. "Nora." My name cracked on her tongue like it carried weight she couldn't set down. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My stillness unsettled her more than any accusation could. She shifted the bouquet from one hand to the other, her mouth twitching as if waiting for me to offer some kind of release. "I didn't think I'd see you here." She tried again, forcing a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. I kept my gaze steady, calm, and unyielding. She sighed, lowering her voice as if she could make the moment private. "I assume you know everything now." The words sounded hollow, as though she still wanted to believe she had some control left. Her tone softened. "You had every right to be angry." "But the way you did it." She stopped, then gave a weak laugh. "You always were the quiet one." I should have known. I tilted my head slightly, the same gesture she used to make when pretending to listen deeply. Her face crumpled for a moment, then steadied. What? Nothing to say. Her voice rose sharp enough to draw glances from nearby shoppers. You destroyed my wedding. You sent our private life to half the town, and you just get to stand there like the victim. I let her words hang in the air unchallenged. Her anger built, because silence leaves no foothold. She whispered, then softer, almost broken. I thought we were friends. It wasn't remorse, not really. It was the recognition of something she couldn't repair. I gave her one single nod, not of agreement, but acknowledgement, and walked away. Behind me, I heard the breath hitch in her chest, the sound of a woman realizing the conversation had ended without her. Later that week, I crossed paths with Mark. It was in the bank of all places where the smell of paper and ink lingered heavy in the air. He didn't see me at first, standing in line with his arms crossed, his jaw set in that rigid way I once mistook for strength. When his eyes found mine, his whole body stiffened. He gave a small nod, the kind men use when they don't know what else to say, a wordless plea not to make things harder. I smiled politely, no more than a twitch of the lips, and stepped forward in line. He didn't protest when I moved ahead of him, not a word. A year ago, he would have barked about fairness, about priority, about his place in the world. Now he simply stood behind me, quiet. When my business was done, I walked past him without goodbye. The letter had already said everything. In the months that followed, their world came apart in ways that needed no help from me. Lila lost clients, contracts dissolved, and the features that once lifted her into local spotlight disappeared without trace. Mark faded from his company's circles, his role quietly reassigned until his name was spoken less and less. Friends who had once circled around them for dinner parties and weekend trips began to distance themselves, whispering, but no longer defending. Their downfall didn't arrive with spectacle. It arrived like water seeping through walls, quiet and unstoppable. For me, life became steadier. I sold the house with its echoes of arguments and replaced it with a smaller one on a hill filled with light and windows that caught the morning sun. Murphy claimed the best corner for his naps, and my father visited with his steady presence, carrying bagels or fixing things that didn't need fixing. I took on fewer hours at school and began teaching art part-time at the community center, watching children splash color onto canvas without fear of mistakes. In their laughter, I found something I had forgotten: joy without weight. The silence in my home no longer felt heavy. It felt chosen. Every so often, I thought of the letter the way it had traveled from my desk to Mark's pocket, from his pocket to the inboxes that cracked open their facade. I remembered the final line and the calm with which I had written it. It was not a weapon. It was a mirror, and that was enough. But I also knew that closure doesn't arrive neatly tied with ribbons. It comes in quiet encounters, at markets and banks, on sidewalks where the past stands in front of you and waits to see if you will break again. Each time, I discovered I wouldn't, and with every step away, I felt the ground beneath me grow more solid. What remained now was not their ruin, but the final step in reclaiming my own peace. And that I knew would come with letting go of even the letter itself. When winter settled in, I found the letter again, the original copy printed on thick paper tucked into the back of my desk drawer. I unfolded it slowly, reading each line in the quiet of my living room. The words no longer stung the way they once had. They carried no sharpness now, only a reminder of the strength it had taken to write them. I traced the closing line with my fingertip. There is nothing louder than the truth whispered at the right moment, and knew that chapter was finished. I carried it to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched the flame curl the edges until the ink turned to smoke. The fire did not roar. It moved, steadily consuming each page with patience until nothing remained but ash. When it was gone, I opened the windows and let the cold air drift through the house. It felt like releasing the last shadow still lingering inside me. Life grew simple again, but never small. I painted more filling canvases with colors that felt alive. I taught children at the community center, their hands messy with paint, their laughter spilling into every corner of the room. My father came by on Sundays, always bringing bagels, always checking the hinges on doors that didn't need fixing. Murphy claimed his patch of sunlight on the rug, snoring through the afternoons. These were the sounds and rhythms of a life rebuilt not with grand gestures, but with steady, honest days. Mark faded from view, moving to another city where no one knew his name. Lila's voice, once everywhere, quieted as her clients left and her polished image slipped away. They became whispers in circles that no longer touched mine. Their lives unraveled not because I shouted, but because the truth was finally allowed to stand where it could not be ignored. I no longer searched for apologies that would never come. What I had gained was far greater: my dignity, my peace, my sense of self, no longer tied to being needed or chosen. I learned that silence can be both shield and sword, that walking away without bending or breaking can be the loudest statement of all. Sometimes people ask if I would take it back if I regret exposing them the way I did. The answer is simple: no, because the life I have now, the quiet mornings, the laughter of children in art class, the freedom of choosing without permission, was only possible after letting go of what I had lost. True justice, I've learned, doesn't always look like fireworks or public victories. Sometimes it's quieter. It's the warmth of knowing you stood in truth when lies tried to erase you. It's burning the letter and opening every window. It's leaving the ruins behind and choosing not to rebuild with broken stones. And so, when I think of Mark and Lila now, I don't feel anger. I feel distance. They belong to a story that no longer claims me. My story is one of endurance, of choosing dignity over despair, and of finding freedom in the life that remains. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most deeply to you. Share your reflections if you'd like, and may we all continue to carry our truths with quiet strength.